The boss's wife humiliates the maid, but when she finds out the maid is his mother, she is left speechless. Hello, welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and turn on notifications. In the vastness of the city, where skyscrapers rose like guardians of untouchable wealth, stood the Garcia mansion. A place of immense opulence, where marble floors gleamed like mirrors and crystal chandeliers sparkled like captured stars. To many, this palace represented the pinnacle of fortune. For Maria, however, it was a gilded cage where her dignity was tested daily. Maria always arrived before sunrise, walking steadily along the long cypress-lined driveway leading to the mansion. She was a woman with skin weathered by the sun and hands hardened by life. Yet her gaze carried a serenity that stood in stark contrast to the hostile environment she faced there. Carmen, her employer, was an imposing woman with a sharp gaze and an even sharper tongue. Always dressed in silk and adorned with jewelry, Carmen was a living picture of perfection, but one mistake in her presence was enough to reveal her true nature: cold, arrogant, and cruel. That particular morning, Maria was in the main hall, carefully polishing the marble floor. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows cast dancing patterns on the ground. Carmen descended the stairs with firm steps, her heels echoing through the hall as if announcing her arrival. She looked at Maria and, without a word of greeting, gave her a scornful glance. "Maria, how long are you going to take to finish this? It seems like all I do is repeat the same orders over and over. Is it really that hard to grasp the basics?" Maria slowly stood up, avoiding direct eye contact, and responded with her usual calm. "I'm almost done, ma'am. Don't worry, the hall will be spotless before Mr. Alejandro arrives." Carmen huffed, crossing her arms. "It had better be. My husband doesn't like carelessness, and you know very well what happens when he's not satisfied." Maria didn't reply. She had learned that no words would ever be enough to appease Carmen. It was better to stay silent, holding on to the strength that kept her going. As Carmen walked away, muttering something about incompetence, Maria resumed her work, but her thoughts drifted far from the mansion. In her mind, she heard the words of her late mother: "Remember, daughter, dignity can never be taken from someone who carries it in their heart." Later, as she prepared lunch in the spacious, modern kitchen, Maria overheard the other staff talking about Carmen. Dolores, the housekeeper, an experienced and pragmatic woman, approached her. "Don't let her words hurt you, Maria. She's like that with everyone, but I can see you have a strength she'll never understand." Maria only smiled. She knew Dolores's words were true, but she also knew that her silence was the only real shield she had. As the afternoon sun cast golden hues over the mansion, Maria was in the study dusting shelves lined with books she'd never dare touch. It was a quiet moment, one where she could lose herself in the rhythm of her work. Yet, her peace was short-lived. While reaching for a high shelf, a framed photograph toppled over and fell to the ground with a sharp crack. She froze. The sound seemed to echo through the room, louder than it should have been. Bending quickly, Maria picked up the frame, relieved to see the glass hadn't shattered. The photo inside, however, caught her off guard. It was of a baby, its tiny face framed by soft curls, with a distinctive birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on its neck. Maria's breath hitched. That birthmark! Her fingers trembled as she brought the frame closer to her face, her heart racing. She had seen that mark before, on her own child. A child she had lost over 20 years ago. Her knees weakened, and she sank into the armchair behind her, the photo still clutched in her hands. Memories she had worked so hard to bury came rushing back: the hospital, the chaos, the tearful search, and the unbearable silence when no answers came. And now, here it was again, a mark she could never forget. She was still staring at the photo when the study door opened, and Alejandro stepped in. He looked startled to see her sitting, an unspoken rule broken. "Maria, is everything all right?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Startled, Maria scrambled to her feet, clutching the photo behind her back. "Yes, sir. I just tripped while cleaning. My apologies." Alejandro's sharp gaze lingered on her for a moment before softening. "Be careful next time," he said, but his tone carried no malice. With a nod, he crossed the room and retrieved a folder from his desk before walking out. Once he was gone, Maria looked down at the photo again, her mind spinning. The resemblance was uncanny, but she needed to be certain. If Alejandro was her son, her lost child, she had to know for sure. But how could she even begin to ask such a question? The day passed in a haze. Maria's usual focus was fractured as she turned over possibilities in her mind. That evening, while preparing to leave, she passed by the family portrait in the grand hallway. She hadn't paid much attention to it before, but now her eyes lingered on Alejandro. His features were familiar, too familiar. Her pulse quickened as she studied the painting, noting the faint curve of the birthmark just visible above his collar. The world seemed to blur around her, her thoughts racing. Could it truly be him? As Maria walked home that night, the city lights blurred into streaks. She replayed every moment in her mind, every sign she might have missed. If Alejandro was indeed her son, she would have to find the courage to uncover the truth. That night, Maria barely slept. Her modest apartment, normally her sanctuary, felt suffocating as her thoughts churned endlessly. The image of Alejandro's face, the curve of that unmistakable birthmark, consumed her mind. Memories of her lost child, his laughter, his first steps, and the anguish of losing him, replayed like an unyielding storm. By morning, Maria resolved to confront the possibility, no matter how improbable or terrifying. She would find a way to speak with Alejandro. Not to accuse or demand, only to seek the truth. At the mansion, she carried on with her duties as usual, though her movements were more deliberate, her gaze sharper. Every now and then, her eyes would flicker toward Alejandro when he passed, noting his expressions, his posture, even the sound of his voice. Late in the afternoon, an opportunity presented itself. Alejandro was alone in the study, reviewing documents. Maria's heart pounded as she stood outside the door, clutching a tray with coffee and biscuits. She hadn't planned exactly what she would say, but she knew she couldn't let the moment pass. Gathering her courage, she knocked softly. "Come in," Alejandro's voice called. She pushed the door open and entered, keeping her steps measured. "Excuse me, sir. I thought you might like some coffee." Alejandro looked up briefly, offering her a polite nod. "Thank you, Maria. Just leave it on the desk." As she placed the tray down, her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than usual. The words were on the tip of her tongue, but her voice faltered. Sensing her hesitation, Alejandro looked up again, this time with curiosity. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his tone steady but inquisitive. Maria straightened, gripping the edge of the tray. "Sir, may I ask you something? It's personal." Alejandro raised an eyebrow, setting his pen down. "That's unusual. What is it?" She hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't bring herself to say it. The risk of being dismissed, or worse, ridiculed, loomed over her. She adjusted her words. "I noticed a mark on your neck the other day. Forgive me for noticing, but it reminded me of someone I lost a long time ago." His expression shifted, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "The birthmark?" "It's always been there," he said casually, then frowned slightly. "Someone you lost?" "Who?" Maria felt a lump in her throat. She searched his eyes, desperate to find a spark of recognition, though she knew it was impossible. "My son," she whispered. He was taken from me when he was just a baby. And he had a birthmark like yours." Alejandro's gaze darkened, his brows knitting together. He leaned back in his chair, silent for a moment. "That's quite a coincidence," he said, though his voice sounded less certain than before. Yes, a coincidence, Maria replied softly, her hands trembling. But sometimes coincidences mean more than we think. Alejandro looked at her intently, his sharp business-like demeanor softening as he saw the emotion in her eyes. Maria, he said carefully, are you suggesting? She shook her head quickly, not wanting to overstep. I'm not suggesting anything, sir. When I saw the photo in this very room, it stirred something in me. Something I thought was buried forever. Please forgive me for speaking out of place. Alejandro leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. He seemed deep in thought, conflicted. Do you have proof? He finally asked, his voice low. Tears welled in Maria's eyes, but she blinked them away. No. Just memories. And a mother's heart that never forgets. The room was thick with silence, the weight of her words lingering between them. Alejandro's expression remained unreadable, but Maria saw a hint of doubt, a crack in his otherwise unshakable composure. I'll look into this, he said after a long pause, his tone measured. But I need time. Maria nodded, her heart heavy but filled with a flicker of hope. Thank you, sir. That's all I ask. As she left the room, tears finally slipped down her cheeks. For the first time in over 2 decades, there was a chance, a fragile, uncertain chance, that her son was alive and standing just a few feet away. The days that followed were marked by an unspoken tension between Maria and Alejandro. Though their interactions remained polite and professional, there was an undeniable weight in every glance they exchanged. Alejandro was quieter than usual, his typically confident demeanor subdued, as if her words had unlocked something within him that he couldn't yet articulate. One evening, Maria was cleaning the library when Alejandro entered unexpectedly. He carried a small box in his hands, his expression unreadable. Maria, he said, his voice steady but softer than usual. I've been thinking about what you told me. She set aside her duster and turned to him, her heart racing. Yes, sir. Alejandro walked toward the desk and placed the box down gently. I looked into my adoption records, he began, glancing at her briefly before continuing. I was told I was abandoned as a baby. But, the details are vague. Too vague, now that I've gone over them again. Maria's breath caught. She took a cautious step closer. What did you find? Alejandro opened the box and pulled out a small, faded baby blanket. It was light blue, with embroidered stars along the edges. This was the only thing I was told belonged to me from before the adoption. Do you recognize it? Maria's knees nearly gave out. She covered her mouth with trembling hands as tears welled in her eyes. That blanket was unmistakable. She had sewn it herself during her pregnancy, carefully stitching each star with love and anticipation for her baby's arrival. Yes, she whispered, her voice breaking. I made it. For my son. Alejandro's expression hardened, though not with anger, rather, with a kind of desperation. He sat down heavily in the chair behind the desk, running a hand through his hair. Maria, if what you're saying is true, then everything I thought I knew about my life, about my parents, is a lie. Maria approached him slowly, her own emotions teetering on the edge. Sir. Alejandro. I never wanted to hurt you. I had to know. He looked up at her, his gaze piercing. Do you have anything else? Anything that proves this beyond a doubt? Maria hesitated, then reached into her pocket. For years, she had carried a photograph of her son as a baby, a small, worn picture that had faded with time but still showed his sweet face and that unmistakable birthmark. She handed it to Alejandro with trembling fingers. He took the photo and studied it intently. His eyes widened as he traced the mark on the baby's neck. It was identical to his. This is me, he said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief. It has to be. Maria nodded, tears streaming down her face. I always believed you were alive. Even when everyone else told me to move on, I knew in my heart that you were out there. Alejandro leaned back in his chair, staring at the photo and then at Maria. If this is true, then the people who raised me, they lied to me. Maria shook her head gently. Maybe they didn't know the truth either. I don't blame them. I'm just grateful you were cared for. That you grew up to be the man you are today. The room fell into a heavy silence. For Alejandro, the revelation was a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, anger, relief, and an overwhelming sense of loss for the mother he never knew. For Maria, it was a moment of bittersweet joy. She had found her son, but their relationship was now a fragile thread that would need careful weaving. Finally, Alejandro spoke, his voice resolute. We need answers. I'll find out the truth, about the adoption, about how this happened. And if someone is responsible for separating us, they will pay. Maria placed a hand over her heart, nodding. Whatever you decide to do, I'm with you. I just want to know the truth. As Alejandro sat in deep contemplation, Maria left the room quietly, giving him the space he needed. But for the first time in over 2 decades, she walked with a sense of purpose, her steps lighter, her heart fuller. Though the road ahead would be challenging, she was no longer alone in her search for answers. She had her son back, or at least, the beginning of him. The days following the revelation were unlike anything Maria had ever experienced. The Garcia mansion, once a place of distant glances and unspoken barriers, began to feel charged with an unfamiliar energy. Alejandro, usually reserved and composed, seemed restless, as if carrying the weight of unspoken questions. Maria, too, was navigating the delicate balance of hope and uncertainty. That morning, as Maria prepared breakfast in the sprawling kitchen, the staff buzzed around her, unaware of the profound shift that had taken place between her and Alejandro. She kept her head low, focusing on her work, but her heart was pounding. Alejandro had requested a private meeting with her after breakfast, and she didn't know what to expect. When the time came, Maria entered the study with a mix of apprehension and determination. Alejandro was already there, standing by the window with a cup of coffee in his hand. The sunlight streaming through highlighted the tension in his posture. Maria, he began, turning to face her. His expression was serious but not unkind. I've been speaking to my family lawyer. I asked him to dig deeper into my adoption records. I need to know exactly what happened. Maria nodded, clasping her hands in front of her to steady them. Thank you, Alejandro. I know this isn't easy for you. He gestured for her to sit, taking the chair across from her. There's something else, he said. I've been trying to recall my earliest memories. It's strange, I don't remember much before I was adopted, but I've been having these flashes, images that don't make sense. A woman's voice, the sound of someone singing a lullaby. Maria's breath hitched. I used to sing to my son every night. A lullaby my mother taught me. Alejandro leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. Can you sing it? Her voice trembled as she began, soft and hesitant, the melody carrying a bittersweet weight. Alejandro closed his eyes, and for a moment, he looked like a man transported to another time. When she finished, there was silence, heavy and profound. I've heard that song before, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how or when, but I know it. Maria felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. Maybe your heart remembers, even if your mind doesn't. Alejandro's jaw tightened, and he nodded. There's one more thing, he said, his tone turning resolute. Carmen knows more than she's letting on. She's been acting strange ever since I mentioned the investigation. I plan to confront her. Maria froze. Carmen's hostility toward her had always been palpable, but she had never considered that Carmen might play a role in the mystery surrounding Alejandro's adoption. Do you think she knew? Maria asked carefully. I don't know, Alejandro admitted, his gaze darkening. But I wouldn't put it past her. She's always been controlling. If she had any hand in this, I'll find out. The conversation left Maria both hopeful and uneasy. Later that evening, she saw Carmen in the dining room, sipping wine as she thumbed through a magazine. The air around her seemed colder than usual. "Maria," Carmen called, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "A word, please." Maria approached cautiously, her hands clasped tightly together. "Yes, ma'am." Carmen set down her glass, her gaze sharp. "Alejandro has been preoccupied lately. I assume you've noticed." "Yes, ma'am," Maria replied evenly. "Good. Then you'll understand when I say that I expect you to stay out of it. Whatever nonsense you've filled his head with, I suggest you stop. Immediately." Maria's heart raced, but she kept her composure. "I haven't filled his head with anything, ma'am. He's searching for the truth, just as I am." Carmen's expression hardened, and for the first time, Maria saw a flicker of fear behind her cold exterior. "The truth," Carmen repeated mockingly. "Be careful, Maria. Not all truths are worth uncovering." The warning hung in the air like a threat. Maria stood her ground, her voice steady. "The truth is always worth it, ma'am. No matter how painful." As she walked away, Maria felt a renewed sense of purpose. Carmen's words only confirmed her suspicions. There was more to the story, and she wouldn't rest until she uncovered it. Later that night, Alejandro found her in the kitchen. "I confronted her," he said, his jaw tight with frustration. "She denied everything, but I could tell she was hiding something. I'm not giving up." Maria placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Neither am I." For the first time, Alejandro smiled faintly. "Thank you, Maria. For your strength. We'll get through this. Together." Maria nodded, her heart swelling with determination. The mansion, once a place of isolation and pain, was now becoming the stage for a transformation, a journey toward the truth, no matter the cost. The atmosphere in the mansion grew heavier with each passing day. Carmen's usually icy composure had begun to crack, revealing glimpses of unease. Maria noticed it in the way Carmen avoided eye contact with Alejandro and how her voice wavered during conversations. Alejandro, on the other hand, became increasingly resolute. He spent hours locked in his study, poring over legal documents and making phone calls, determined to unravel the mystery of his past. One afternoon, Maria found herself in the garden trimming roses, a chore she often sought out to calm her nerves. The delicate blooms reminded her of her late mother, who had taught her how to care for plants as a child. The tranquility was interrupted when Alejandro appeared, his face a mix of anger and determination. "Maria," he called, striding toward her. "I need to speak with you." She set down her shears, brushing dirt from her hands. "Of course, sir. What is it?" He took a deep breath, as if steadying himself. "I received a call from my investigator. He managed to track down a nurse who worked at the hospital where I was supposedly abandoned." Maria's heart skipped a beat. "And? What did she say?" Alejandro's jaw tightened. "She remembers a woman, dark-haired, distressed, begging for help after her baby disappeared from his crib. She tried to report it, but someone higher up dismissed her claims and transferred her to another department." Tears filled Maria's eyes. She clutched the edge of the rose trellis to steady herself. "That was me," she whispered. "I remember that day so vividly. No one believed me. They thought I was lying, that I had lost my mind." Alejandro's expression softened, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You weren't lying, Maria. Someone deliberately took me. The investigator is working to uncover who was behind it, but," he hesitated, his gaze darkening. "I can't shake the feeling that Carmen knows more than she's letting on." Maria's stomach turned. She had long suspected Carmen's involvement, but hearing Alejandro voice it out loud made it feel all the more real. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice trembling. I need to confront her again, Alejandro said firmly. But this time, I'll have evidence to back me up. I want you to be there. Maria froze. Me? Are you sure? Yes, he said without hesitation. You're the only person I trust in this. You deserve to hear the truth as much as I do. That evening, as the mansion descended into its usual quiet, Alejandro summoned Carmen to the study. Maria stood nearby, her heart pounding in her chest. When Carmen entered, her eyes flicked between the two of them, suspicion evident on her face. What is this about, Alejandro? She asked, her tone clipped. Alejandro stood by his desk, arms crossed. It's about the truth, Carmen. The truth about my adoption, and what you know. Carmen's eyes narrowed. I've already told you everything. There's nothing more to say. Alejandro stepped closer, his voice low but commanding. Stop lying. I spoke to a nurse from the hospital. She remembers a woman, Maria, desperate to find her baby. A baby with a birthmark identical to mine. Do you still want to tell me you know nothing? Carmen stiffened, her mask of indifference slipping for just a moment. This is absurd. Are you seriously accusing me of something? What proof do you have? Maria stepped forward, clutching the photograph of her baby. This, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. This is the proof. Look at him, Carmen. Look at my son. Carmen's gaze flickered to the photo, and for the briefest moment, guilt flashed across her face. She quickly composed herself, but it was too late. Alejandro had seen it. Carmen, he said, his voice filled with quiet fury. What did you do? Carmen's hands clenched into fists. Fine, she spat, her voice sharp. You want the truth? Yes, I knew. I knew you weren't abandoned. I knew Maria was your mother. But you were better off without her. You deserved a life of privilege, not one of poverty and struggle. Maria gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Alejandro's expression darkened, his hands trembling with anger. You had no right to make that decision for me, he said, his voice shaking. You stole my life. You stole her life. Carmen's defiance faltered, and for the first time, she looked genuinely remorseful. I thought I was doing what was best for you. You were just a baby. I thought I could give you everything she couldn't. Maria stepped forward, her voice filled with quiet strength. Everything except the one thing that truly matters, a mother's love. The room fell silent. Carmen lowered her head, her once unshakable confidence shattered. Alejandro turned to Maria, his expression softening. We'll make this right, he said firmly. Together. Maria nodded, her tears flowing freely. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her loss begin to lift. Though the journey had been painful, the truth was finally coming to light. And with it, a chance for healing. Carmen's confession lingered in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. She sat down slowly in one of the leather chairs in the study, her hands trembling as she gripped the armrests. Alejandro and Maria stood frozen, the weight of her words settling over them like a crushing tide. Alejandro broke the silence first. His voice was calm, but it carried an undercurrent of restrained fury. You thought you could rewrite my life without consequences? That you had the right to decide what was best for me? For her. He gestured toward Maria, whose tear-streaked face mirrored the pain of decades lost. Carmen looked up, her composure cracked but not entirely broken. I was protecting you, she insisted, her voice shaking but resolute. You don't know what the world is like outside these walls. You would have grown up in poverty, Alejandro. Do you think you'd be where you are now if I hadn't stepped in? Maria stepped forward, her voice filled with quiet but unyielding strength. You didn't protect him, Carmen. You stole him. You didn't just take my son, you took away his chance to know who he truly is. And you took from yourself the chance to do the right thing. Carmen's face twisted with conflict, the walls of justification she had built over the years crumbling under the weight of Maria's words. I thought I was helping, she whispered, though even she seemed uncertain of her conviction now. Alejandro leaned against the desk, his head bowed for a moment before he straightened and looked at Carmen with piercing intensity. You don't get to justify this anymore. You've lied to me for years. And now, you will tell me everything. Every single detail. Carmen hesitated, visibly torn. But Alejandro's unwavering gaze left no room for argument. With a deep breath, she began to speak. It was more than 20 years ago, she started, her voice barely above a whisper. Your father and I, we wanted a child. But I couldn't have one. Every attempt, every treatment, failed. I was desperate. We both were. And then, one day, someone approached us, a man who said he could make our dream of having a family come true. He didn't say where the baby would come from, and I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. Maria's knees nearly buckled, but she forced herself to stay upright. You took him from a mother who was searching for him, crying for him, she said, her voice breaking. Carmen's eyes filled with tears, her hands twisting in her lap. I didn't know, Maria. Not at first. But later, when I learned the truth, I was too afraid to say anything. By then, Alejandro was already our son. I told myself it was too late, that exposing the truth would only hurt everyone. Alejandro's fists clenched at his sides. So you let the lie grow. You let Maria suffer while you played the perfect mother. I'm not proud of what I did, Carmen admitted, her voice cracking. I didn't think you would ever find out. But I see now. I was wrong. Maria stepped closer, her eyes locked on Carmen. You were wrong about many things. But I'll tell you one thing you didn't ruin, my love for my son. That never wavered. And now that I have the chance, I'll spend every moment showing him the truth of that love. Alejandro turned to Maria, his expression softening. And I'll spend every moment trying to understand what I lost, and what I've gained. The room fell into a tense silence, the echoes of Carmen's confession reverberating like distant thunder. Finally, Alejandro straightened and looked at Carmen with cold finality. You will come clean to everyone, he said. No more lies. No more manipulations. If there are records, I want them. If there are people involved, I want their names. This ends now. Carmen nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I'll do whatever you ask, she said quietly. As Maria and Alejandro left the study, they walked side by side, their steps in sync. For the first time, Maria felt the faint stirrings of hope. It would take time, but she and Alejandro were on the path to healing, and to uncovering the full truth of their stolen years. In the hallway, Alejandro paused and looked at Maria. Thank you for not giving up on me, he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Maria smiled through her tears. I never could. You're my son. They stood there for a moment, a fragile but growing bond forming between them. Whatever the future held, they were determined to face it together. The mansion was quiet that night, but the air was thick with unresolved tension. Maria lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed the events of the day, the revelations, the pain etched on Alejandro's face, and Carmen's fragile confession. Despite everything, Maria felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was finally emerging, but she knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, Maria arrived at the mansion early, as always. The usual routine of cleaning and preparing the house felt almost surreal after the emotional whirlwind of the previous day. As she was dusting the sitting room, Alejandro entered, dressed impeccably as usual, but there was a heaviness in his eyes. Maria, he said softly, gesturing for her to sit. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should break the unspoken rules of employer and employee, but his gentle insistence made her comply. I spoke to Carmen again late last night, he began, sitting across from her. She gave me the name of the man who orchestrated my adoption. Maria's heart quickened. Who is he? Ricardo Vasquez, Alejandro said, the name falling from his lips like a curse. Apparently, he ran a network that specialized in illegal adoptions. He preyed on desperate families, both those wanting children and those who had lost them. Maria's hands clenched in her lap. The name wasn't familiar, but the anger it stirred in her was undeniable. Where is he now? Alejandro leaned back, his expression grim. He disappeared years ago. Carmen claims she hasn't heard from him since the adoption was finalized. But I don't believe she's told me everything. Maria nodded, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. What do we do now? Alejandro's gaze met hers, determination burning in his eyes. We find him. He's the key to understanding everything. If he's still out there, I'll make him answer for what he's done. Later that day, Alejandro called his investigator, instructing him to focus all efforts on locating Ricardo Vasquez. Maria listened from a distance, her heart heavy but resolute. She wasn't sure how much more pain the search would unearth, but she knew they couldn't stop now. Meanwhile, Carmen's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She avoided Maria entirely, and even Alejandro's presence seemed to unsettle her. Maria observed her from the corner of her eye as she worked, noting the way Carmen's hands shook when she poured her morning coffee or how she flinched at sudden noises. That evening, Maria found herself alone in the kitchen, washing dishes. Carmen entered unexpectedly, her expression guarded. Maria paused, wiping her hands on a towel as Carmen approached. Maria, Carmen began, her voice unusually subdued. Maria turned to face her, keeping her posture calm. Yes, ma'am. Carmen hesitated, her hands twisting nervously. I owe you an apology. Maria's eyebrows rose slightly. Of all the things she expected, this wasn't one of them. I've spent so long convincing myself that what I did was justified, Carmen continued, her voice trembling. But seeing the pain in Alejandro's eyes, seeing the strength in yours, I realize I was wrong. Terribly wrong. Maria regarded her carefully, searching for sincerity in her words. You can't undo what was done, Carmen. But you can help us find the answers we need. Carmen nodded slowly. I'll cooperate. I'll tell Alejandro everything I know about Ricardo, no matter how incriminating it might be. It's the least I can do. Maria allowed herself a small nod of acknowledgement. For Alejandro's sake, I hope you mean it. When Carmen left, Maria leaned against the counter, exhaling deeply. Trust wouldn't come easily, but at least Carmen seemed to be taking a step in the right direction. The next morning, Alejandro received a call from the investigator. Maria was cleaning the dining room when she heard him shout from his study. Dropping her duster, she hurried to the door and found him pacing, his phone pressed to his ear. When? Where? He demanded, his voice sharp. He listened intently, his expression shifting from anger to grim satisfaction. Good. I'll handle the rest. Thank you. When he hung up, Maria stepped into the room. What is it? They found him, Alejandro said, his voice laced with resolve. Ricardo Vasquez is alive. He's been hiding in a small town outside of Monterrey. Maria's heart pounded. What happens now? Alejandro's gaze hardened. We go to him. He's going to answer for what he did. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. For Maria, it was a chance to reclaim the years stolen from her. For Alejandro, it was an opportunity to confront the man who had shaped the lies of his past. Together, they prepared for the next step, knowing that whatever awaited them in Monterrey, they would face it side by side. The journey to Monterrey was heavy with anticipation. Alejandro drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as the highway stretched endlessly before them. Maria sat in the passenger seat, clutching a small photo of her baby, now a man, close to her chest. Neither spoke much during the drive, the weight of their shared purpose filling the silence between them. As they approached the outskirts of Monterrey, Alejandro glanced at Maria. "Are you ready for this?" She nodded, though her heart was racing. "I've waited over 20 years for answers. I'm as ready as I'll ever be." The investigator had provided an address for Ricardo Vasquez, a crumbling house in a neglected neighborhood. When they arrived, the streets were eerily quiet, and the house itself seemed to sag under the weight of its own decay. The paint was peeling, the windows covered with grime, and the front gate hung askew. Alejandro parked the car and turned to Maria. "Stay close to me. We don't know what kind of man we're dealing with." They approached the house together, Alejandro's presence imposing despite his calm demeanor. He knocked firmly on the door, the sound echoing through the hollow space inside. For a moment, there was no response, but then the sound of shuffling footsteps grew closer. The door creaked open, revealing an older man with disheveled gray hair and tired, sunken eyes. He looked at them suspiciously, his gaze flickering between Alejandro and Maria. "What do you want?" he asked gruffly, his voice raspy from years of cigarettes or perhaps guilt. Alejandro didn't hesitate. "Are you Ricardo Vasquez?" The man's expression hardened. "Who's asking?" "I'm Alejandro Garcia," he said, his voice steady. "And this is Maria. We're here to talk about what you did 23 years ago at the hospital in Mexico City." Ricardo's face paled, his grip on the door tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly, trying to shut the door. Alejandro pushed it open with surprising force, his tone now sharp. "Yes, you do. And you're going to tell us everything. Right now." Ricardo stumbled back, his bravado crumbling under Alejandro's intensity. Maria stepped forward, her voice filled with a quiet strength that stopped Ricardo in his tracks. "You took my son," she said, her eyes boring into his. "You stole him from me and sold him. Do you have any idea what that did to my life? To his life?" Ricardo's hands trembled, and he backed into the small, cluttered living room. I didn't have a choice," he stammered. "It was just business. I needed the money. You don't understand." Alejandro cut him off. "You ruined lives for money. You think that's an excuse?" Ricardo sank into a worn armchair, his face buried in his hands. "I was desperate. People paid a lot for babies back then. And there were families who wanted children so badly they didn't ask questions." Maria's voice trembled, but she refused to back down. "You're talking about children, about lives. You ripped them away from their families, from their mothers. How many did you take? How many lives did you destroy?" Ricardo looked up at her, tears brimming in his eyes. "Too many," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But I wasn't the only one. There were others, doctors, lawyers, even wealthy families. They made sure everything looked legitimate. I was just a piece of the machine." Alejandro stepped closer, his tone icy. "Give me names. Every name. Every person involved. If you don't, I'll make sure the authorities get involved, and I'll see to it that you rot in prison for the rest of your life." Ricardo's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Fine," he said. "I'll tell you what I know. But you have to understand, some of these people are powerful. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves." Maria clenched her fists, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "We don't care how powerful they are. We care about the truth." Over the next hour, Ricardo recounted everything, the network of corrupt officials and wealthy families who had funded the illegal adoption ring, the falsified records, and the bribes that kept authorities from investigating. He even admitted to remembering Maria, her desperate face seared into his memory after all these years. "She didn't deserve this," he said, his voice heavy with remorse. "None of them did. When he finished, Alejandro stood, his expression unreadable. "We'll take this information to the authorities. But make no mistake, Ricardo, this isn't over for you." As they left the house, Maria felt a mixture of emotions, anger, sorrow, and an odd sense of vindication. She had finally confronted the man who had stolen her son, but the road ahead was far from over. Back in the car, Alejandro looked at her. "We'll use this. We'll expose every single one of them." Maria nodded, her voice firm. "For all the mothers who lost their children. For all the children who never got to know the truth." As they drove away from the decaying house, they carried with them the weight of what they had learned, and the determination to ensure that justice would finally be served. The drive back to the city was somber, the weight of Ricardo's revelations pressing down on both Maria and Alejandro. The man's confession had been chilling, not only because of what he had done but because it painted a picture of a larger, deeply corrupt system that had preyed on the most vulnerable. Maria stared out the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The anger simmering in her chest was matched only by her resolve to see justice done. Alejandro broke the silence, his voice low but resolute. "We have names now. Names of people who built their lives on stolen children. This isn't just about us anymore, Maria. It's about all the families who suffered because of them." Maria turned to him, her expression serious. "What do we do next?" Alejandro's jaw tightened. "I'll contact my lawyer first thing in the morning. We need to take this to the authorities, but carefully. If what Ricardo said is true, some of these people still have power. They won't go down without a fight." Maria nodded, though the thought of more delays tested her patience. "Whatever it takes," she said quietly. "But we can't let them get away with this." The next morning, Alejandro followed through on his promise. He met with his lawyer, a trusted family advisor named Eduardo Castellanos, in the privacy of his study. Maria sat nearby, listening intently as Alejandro laid out everything Ricardo had confessed. Eduardo's face grew increasingly grave as Alejandro spoke. When he finished, the lawyer leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "This is explosive," Eduardo said. "If what Ricardo told you is accurate, this could implicate high-profile individuals in a major criminal operation. It won't be easy to bring them down." Alejandro leaned forward, his expression unyielding. "I don't care how hard it is. These people destroyed lives. They need to face justice." Eduardo nodded slowly. "Then we'll need to act strategically. First, I'll arrange a meeting with a trusted prosecutor, someone who won't be intimidated or bribed. We'll present the evidence and begin building a case. But you need to prepare yourselves. This will be a long, messy fight, and the people you're up against will retaliate." Maria's voice was steady as she spoke. "I've already lost so much. I'm not afraid of them." Eduardo gave her a small, approving nod. "Then let's get started." Over the next few days, the mansion became a hub of activity. Eduardo and his team worked tirelessly, compiling documents, verifying Ricardo's claims, and preparing a formal report for the prosecutor. Alejandro balanced his business obligations with the mounting legal battle, his focus unwavering. Maria, though not directly involved in the legal preparations, found herself at the center of Alejandro's emotional support. He often sought her out in quiet moments, sharing his frustrations and doubts. One evening, as they sat in the garden under the fading light of dusk, Alejandro spoke softly. Do you think we'll ever feel whole after this?" Maria looked at him, her eyes filled with both sorrow and determination. "I don't know if we'll ever feel whole, Alejandro. But I do know that finding the truth is the first step. And the rest we'll figure out together." As the weeks passed, the case began to take shape. Eduardo secured a meeting with a prosecutor, a determined woman named Victoria Salinas, known for her integrity and fearlessness in taking on powerful adversaries. The day of the meeting, Maria and Alejandro arrived at the prosecutor's office armed with files of evidence and Ricardo's recorded confession. Victoria listened intently as they recounted their story, her sharp eyes never leaving them. When they finished, she leaned forward, her voice firm. "This is one of the most significant cases I've seen in years. If we handle it correctly, we can bring down everyone involved. But it won't be easy. These people will fight back, and they'll fight dirty." "We're ready," Alejandro said without hesitation. Victoria's gaze shifted to Maria. "And you, Señora? Are you ready to face what's coming? It won't just be legal battles. The media will latch onto this, and your life will be under scrutiny." Maria straightened her back, her resolve clear. "I've lived in silence and pain for over 20 years. If speaking out can help even one mother find her child, it's worth it." Victoria nodded, a glimmer of respect in her eyes. "Then let's begin." As they left the office that day, Maria felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, hope, and an unshakable determination. The road ahead would be treacherous, but for the first time in decades, she felt like she was walking toward the light, not away from it. Alejandro walked beside her, his hand brushing against hers briefly, a silent gesture of support. "We'll get through this, Maria," he said softly. She looked at him, her heart swelling with both pride and sorrow. "Yes, we will. Together." The battle began quietly but with an intensity that Maria and Alejandro could feel in every step. Victoria Salinas wasted no time, filing preliminary documents to officially open the investigation. As promised, the case quickly attracted attention, and whispers began to circulate in high circles, names mentioned in Ricardo's confession, once untouchable, now spoken with caution. Maria's world transformed almost overnight. Reporters began to appear near the mansion gates, their cameras and microphones ready to capture any statement or slip of emotion. Alejandro hired additional security to keep the house and Maria protected. But the media's interest was only the beginning. One morning, as Maria was preparing breakfast, Alejandro entered the kitchen, a grim expression on his face. He carried a newspaper, its bold headline screaming, "Illicit Adoption Scandal Shakes High Society." Beneath it were blurred photos of infants and an ominous subheading, "Allegations of Stolen Children Point to Wealthy Elite." Maria paused, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "It's starting," she said quietly. Alejandro placed the paper on the counter and leaned against it, his eyes on her. "This is only the first wave. It's going to get worse." She met his gaze, her expression firm despite the unease in her chest. "Let them dig. Let the whole world see the truth." Later that day, a meeting was held in the study with Eduardo and Victoria present. Eduardo laid out a plan, the details meticulous and cautious. "We need to control the narrative," he said, his voice steady. "The media will try to sensationalize this, and those involved will fight back. They'll paint Maria as a liar, claim she's after money, or try to discredit the investigation altogether." Victoria nodded in agreement. "We'll need to counter their tactics at every step. Maria, are you willing to speak publicly? To tell your story?" Maria hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "If it helps the case, I'll do it." Alejandro frowned, concern evident in his eyes. "Are you sure? Once your name is out there, it won't be easy to take it back." "I'm sure," Maria said firmly. "I've lived in silence long enough. If this is what it takes to bring them down, I'll do it." 2 days later, Maria gave her first public statement. Standing at a podium in front of a row of microphones, with Alejandro and Victoria by her side, she shared her story. Her voice wavered at first, but as she spoke, it grew steadier, fueled by the raw emotion of years of pain and loss. "I lost my son over 20 years ago," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "For years, I searched for him, but no one listened. They told me he was gone, that I should move on. But a mother's heart never stops looking, never stops hoping. And now, I found him, only to learn that he was stolen from me and sold like a piece of property. This isn't just my story. There are countless other mothers and children who deserve the truth. And we will not stop until justice is served. The crowd erupted in questions, flashes from cameras nearly blinding her. Alejandro stepped in, deflecting the more aggressive inquiries, while Victoria addressed the legal aspects of the case. Despite the chaos, Maria felt a sense of release. Speaking her truth in front of the world felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been buried for so long. That night, back at the mansion, Alejandro found Maria sitting in the garden, staring at the stars. He joined her, sitting in silence for a moment before speaking. "You were incredible today," he said. She smiled faintly, her gaze still on the sky. "I didn't feel brave. I felt terrified. But I had to do it, for you, for the other mothers, for myself." Alejandro reached out, placing a hand gently over hers. "You're stronger than you realize." As the days turned into weeks, the investigation gained momentum. More names surfaced, more secrets were exposed. Maria and Alejandro became the public faces of the fight, their bond growing stronger with each step. But their enemies were not idle. Anonymous threats began to arrive, letters slipped under the mansion gate, cryptic phone calls in the middle of the night. Alejandro tightened security further, but Maria refused to be intimidated. "They want to scare us," she told him one evening. "Because they're scared. That means we're winning." Alejandro nodded, his admiration for her unwavering courage evident. "And we'll keep fighting. Together." The road ahead remained treacherous, but Maria and Alejandro were no longer alone. The truth, once buried beneath lies and corruption, was finally emerging into the light, and they were ready to see it through to the end. The threats grew bolder with each passing day. What began as anonymous letters and phone calls escalated to more alarming acts. One morning, as Maria stepped out of her apartment to head to the mansion, she found her door defaced with red paint spelling out the word liar. Her heart raced, but she refused to let fear consume her. Instead, she grabbed a cloth and wiped the paint away with determined strokes, refusing to let it remain as a mark of intimidation. When Maria arrived at the mansion, Alejandro noticed her silence immediately. She placed her bag down carefully in the kitchen, her movements slow and deliberate. "What happened?" Alejandro asked, his tone sharp with concern. She hesitated but then decided he needed to know. "Someone vandalized my door. They called me a liar." Alejandro's expression darkened. "This is unacceptable. I'll have security posted outside your apartment starting tonight." "You don't have to do that," Maria protested. "I can take care of myself." "Maria," Alejandro said firmly, stepping closer. "You're part of this fight now, and that makes you a target. I won't take chances with your safety." She nodded reluctantly, seeing the worry etched in his face. "Thank you," she said softly. That same afternoon, Victoria Salinas arrived at the mansion with new developments. She carried a stack of documents under her arm, her expression as resolute as ever. Alejandro led her into the study, where Maria joined them. "I have good news and bad news," Victoria began, setting the papers down on the desk. "The good news is that more victims are coming forward. We're building a stronger case every day." Alejandro nodded. "And the bad news?" Victoria sighed. "We're seeing signs that some of the individuals implicated are using their influence to stall the investigation. Files are going missing, witnesses are being silenced, and certain officials are suddenly unwilling to cooperate." Maria felt a chill run through her. "What do we do?" "We keep pushing," Victoria said firmly. "But we have to be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better. These people won't go down without a fight." Alejandro's jaw tightened. "Then we'll fight harder. Whatever it takes." Later that evening, Maria sat alone in her room, clutching the small photo of Alejandro as a baby. The image had become a symbol of everything she was fighting for, not just her son, but every child stolen from their family. She thought of the other mothers who might still be searching, who might still be waiting for answers. A knock at the door startled her. Alejandro stepped inside, his expression softer than it had been earlier. "I wanted to check on you," he said. "After everything today." Maria smiled faintly, gesturing for him to sit. "I'm fine, Alejandro. I've been through worse." He sat across from her, his eyes searching hers. "You shouldn't have to go through this alone." "I'm not alone," she said, her voice steady. "I have you. And that means everything." Alejandro leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about the other mothers. Maybe when this is over, we could do something. Start a foundation or an organization to help reunite families, to fight for those who can't fight for themselves." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "That's a beautiful idea. And I think it's exactly what we should do." The conversation left both of them feeling lighter, as if the weight of their struggle was finally transforming into purpose. The next day, a breakthrough came unexpectedly. Eduardo arrived with a document, an internal memo leaked from one of the implicated officials. It detailed payments made to Ricardo Vasquez and others involved in the illegal adoption ring. "This is the smoking gun," Eduardo said, his voice filled with excitement. "It proves there was a network, and it ties them to specific individuals." Victoria examined the document carefully, her expression hardening. "This changes everything. We can go after them directly now." Maria and Alejandro exchanged a glance, a spark of hope lighting between them. The walls built by corruption and lies were beginning to crack, and for the first time, they could see the possibility of victory. That evening, as Maria walked through the mansion's gardens, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt like they were gaining ground. Alejandro joined her, his hands in his pockets as he walked beside her. "We're getting closer," he said softly. Maria looked at him, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "Yes, we are. And we won't stop until we reach the truth." Under the glow of the moonlight, they stood side by side, united by their shared determination. The journey ahead would be grueling, but they were ready to face it, together. The leaked memo was a turning point. Victoria moved swiftly, filing motions to subpoena financial records, emails, and communications that could connect the names in Ricardo's confession to the illegal adoption network. The case now had teeth, and with each passing day, the momentum grew. But as the pressure increased, so did the retaliation. One morning, as Maria arrived at the mansion, she found Alejandro waiting for her at the door. His expression was tense, and his phone was clutched tightly in his hand. "Maria," he said, his voice low but urgent. "There's something you need to see." He led her into the study, where a news broadcast was paused on the large television. The anchor's face was frozen mid-sentence, the headline below reading, "Ex-domestic worker accuses prominent family of kidnapping allegations in adoption scandal." Maria's heart sank. "What is this?" Alejandro pressed play, and the anchor's voice filled the room. In a shocking twist to the ongoing adoption scandal, sources close to the investigation claim that Maria Ramos, a former domestic worker, is fabricating her story in an attempt to extort money from the wealthy Garcia family. Anonymous statements allege that Ramos has no proof of her connection to the case and is using the media to gain sympathy. Maria stared at the screen, her blood running cold. The lies were a direct attack, meant to discredit her and undermine the investigation. "This is how they fight back," Alejandro said, his jaw clenched. "They're trying to destroy your credibility." Maria sat down heavily in a nearby chair, her hands trembling. "I knew they'd try to silence us, but this..." Alejandro knelt in front of her, his voice steady. "They're scared, Maria. This is a desperate move. They know the truth is coming, and they're trying to stop it. But we won't let them." Maria nodded, her resolve hardening. What do we do? Alejandro stood, pacing the room. We counter their lies with the truth. We'll call a press conference and present the evidence we've gathered so far. Let the world see that they're the ones who are lying. Later that day, Alejandro, Maria, Victoria, and Eduardo met in the study to plan their response. Victoria was unflinching as she outlined their next steps. We need to keep Maria's credibility intact, she said. We'll release statements to trusted media outlets with the evidence we can disclose. And Maria, she turned to her, her gaze firm, you'll need to speak again. Directly to the public. Maria took a deep breath, steadying herself. I'll do it. If they want to tarnish my name, I'll fight back with the truth. The press conference was scheduled for the next morning. As Maria prepared, Alejandro stayed by her side, offering quiet support. You've been through worse than this, he said softly. They can't break you. Maria smiled faintly, her eyes filled with determination. They won't. Not now. Not ever. When the time came, Maria stood before the cameras once again. This time, she was flanked by Alejandro and Victoria, their presence a powerful testament to their unity. I want to address the lies being spread about me, Maria began, her voice clear and unwavering. For over 20 years, I searched for my son. I never gave up, even when everyone told me it was hopeless. Now that I've found him, the people who took him are trying to silence me. But I will not be silenced. She held up the photograph of Alejandro as a baby, her hand steady. This is my son. The same boy who was stolen from me and sold into a life I never agreed to. I have proof, and I have the truth on my side. To the people spreading lies about me, your time is running out. The room erupted in questions, but Maria remained composed. Alejandro stepped forward to address the media, reinforcing her statements with the evidence Eduardo had compiled. By the end of the conference, the tide had begun to turn. Public opinion shifted as more people rallied behind Maria, inspired by her courage and unyielding determination. But the fight was far from over. That evening, Victoria received a tip from a whistleblower who had worked within the adoption network. The message was brief but chilling: there are more powerful players involved than you know. Be careful. Victoria shared the message with Maria and Alejandro, her expression grave. This means the stakes are even higher. We're not just dealing with corrupt individuals. We're dealing with a system that's been protected for years. Maria met her gaze, her voice steady. Then we expose the system. Piece by piece, if we have to. But we won't stop. Alejandro placed a hand on her shoulder, his strength and determination matching hers. Not until every truth is uncovered. That night, as Maria sat in her small apartment, she reflected on how far they had come, and how much further they still had to go. But for the first time in decades, she didn't feel alone. The truth was on their side, and together, they were unstoppable. The pressure mounted as the days passed. The public had started to rally behind Maria after her brave speech, but the opposition was relentless. Every new piece of evidence that surfaced seemed to spark a counterattack: anonymous articles, online smear campaigns, and thinly veiled threats disguised as concerned citizens. Despite this, Maria's resolve only grew stronger. She spent her days between the mansion and the prosecutor's office, working with Alejandro, Victoria, and Eduardo to uncover the final pieces of the puzzle. Each night, she returned to her apartment, where security guards now stood watch. One evening, as Maria reviewed old photographs and letters in her modest living room, Alejandro knocked on her door. When she opened it, he held a small box wrapped in plain paper. "I found something," he said, stepping inside. Maria gestured for him to sit, her curiosity piqued. He placed the box on the coffee table and carefully opened it. Inside was a collection of documents, birth certificates, hospital records, and a faded envelope with an official seal. These were hidden in a storage unit Carmen forgot about, Alejandro explained, his tone grim. When I confronted her about them, she claimed she didn't know they were there. But look at this. He handed Maria the envelope. It bore the name Ricardo Vasquez and a date, a week after Alejandro's supposed adoption. Maria opened it cautiously and found a receipt for a substantial payment, signed by Ricardo himself. This proves he was paid, Alejandro said, his voice tight with anger. But there's more. The hospital records show inconsistencies in your son's birth file. Someone tampered with it to erase the connection to you. Maria's hands trembled as she held the documents. This is what we needed, she whispered. Proof that the adoption wasn't legal, that they knew what they were doing. Alejandro nodded. We need to get this to Victoria immediately. It could be the final piece of the case. The next morning, they met with Victoria and Eduardo in the prosecutor's office. Victoria studied the documents carefully, her sharp eyes scanning each page. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair, a glint of determination in her expression. This is it, she said. With this, we can move forward with formal charges against Ricardo and everyone else involved. It's concrete, undeniable evidence of a criminal network. Maria exhaled, the weight of years of doubt and pain lifting slightly. So, what happens now? Victoria smiled faintly. Now, we bring them to justice. The following days were a whirlwind of legal action. Arrest warrants were issued for Ricardo and several other individuals named in the investigation. The media exploded with coverage as high-profile figures were implicated, their reputations crumbling under the weight of the evidence. But the fight wasn't without its dangers. One night, as Maria prepared to leave the mansion after a long day, a sleek black car idled near the gate. The driver's window rolled down slightly, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. Maria Ramos, he called, his voice calm but unnervingly cold. She froze, her instincts screaming at her to stay back. Who's asking? The man smiled faintly. Just someone with a piece of advice. You've made powerful enemies. If I were you, I'd stop digging before it's too late. Before Maria could respond, Alejandro appeared behind her, his presence commanding. If you have something to say, you say it to me, he said, his voice sharp. The man's smile faded. Careful, Mr. Garcia. Some things are better left buried. Alejandro stepped forward, his tone turning icy. If you think a vague threat is going to scare us, you're wasting your time. Now, leave before I call the police. The man hesitated for a moment, then got back into the car and drove away. Maria turned to Alejandro, her hands shaking slightly. They're trying to intimidate us, she said, her voice steady despite the fear simmering beneath. And they're failing, Alejandro replied firmly. We're too close to the truth. They know it, and they're desperate. The incident only fueled their determination. The next morning, Victoria announced that formal charges had been filed against Ricardo and several co-conspirators. The legal system would now take over, and while the battle was far from over, it felt like a victory. That evening, Maria and Alejandro sat in the mansion's garden, the soft glow of lanterns casting a warm light around them. You've been so strong through all of this, Alejandro said, his voice filled with admiration. Maria looked at him, her expression soft. I've had to be. For my son. For myself. And now, for all the others who've suffered because of these people. Alejandro nodded, his gaze steady. We'll make sure they face justice. Every single one of them. As the night deepened, they sat in silence, the weight of the journey behind them blending with the hope of what was still to come. For the first time in years, Maria felt like the future held more than pain. It held the promise of healing, of justice, and of finally reclaiming what had been stolen. The days following the charges being filed were a whirlwind of emotions. News of the arrest spread rapidly, dominating headlines and media coverage. Ricardo Vasquez was taken into custody, along with several others implicated in the illegal adoption network. The once hidden web of corruption was beginning to unravel under the public scrutiny. Maria watched the news from the mansion's living room, her hands clasped tightly together. Every broadcast, every article felt like a small victory, but the journey wasn't over. Justice was on the horizon, but Maria knew there were still battles to fight. Alejandro joined her, holding a folder in his hands. Victoria sent over the final list of charges, he said, sitting beside her. Ricardo and the others will face a trial. It's official now. Maria looked at him, her eyes filled with both relief and apprehension. Do you think they'll be convicted? They have to be, Alejandro said, his voice steady. The evidence is overwhelming. But it will take time. Trials like this aren't quick. Maria nodded, the reality settling over her. Time doesn't matter as long as the truth comes out. As long as they pay for what they've done. Alejandro reached over and placed a comforting hand on hers. They will, Maria. I promise you that. A week later, Victoria informed them that the first court hearings were scheduled. Maria and Alejandro were expected to testify as key witnesses. The idea of facing Ricardo again, this time in a courtroom, filled Maria with a mix of dread and determination. The day of the hearing arrived, and Maria dressed carefully, choosing a modest but elegant outfit. Alejandro, in his tailored suit, stood by her side as they entered the courthouse. The atmosphere inside was tense, reporters and cameras flashing everywhere, but Maria kept her head high. In the courtroom, Ricardo sat at the defendant's table, his once confident demeanor replaced by a sullen, defeated expression. He avoided Maria's gaze, but she refused to look away. When it was her turn to testify, Maria walked to the stand with steady steps. She swore her oath and took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room before settling on the judge. Tell us about the day your son was taken, the prosecutor prompted gently. Maria began to speak, her voice trembling at first but gaining strength as she recounted the events of that fateful day. She described the hospital, the chaos, the disbelief when no one believed her, and the years of silence that followed. When she spoke about finding Alejandro again, her voice broke with emotion. I never stopped looking for him. I never stopped hoping. And when I finally found him, I learned that he had been stolen and sold, as if our lives didn't matter. The courtroom was silent, her words hanging in the air like a weight. Even the judge seemed moved by her testimony. When the defense attorney began their cross-examination, their approach was sharp, attempting to discredit her memory and motives. Mrs. Ramos, the attorney said, his tone clipped, after all these years, how can you be so certain this man is your son? Maria held her ground. A mother knows her child, she said firmly. And we have the evidence to prove it. Blood tests, documents, things that cannot be disputed. The attorney tried to press further, but Maria's unwavering resolve left little room for doubt. When Alejandro took the stand, his testimony was equally compelling. He spoke of his life as a Garcia, his realization that his past had been built on lies, and his determination to uncover the truth. My adoptive mother, Carmen Garcia, admitted to knowing the adoption wasn't legal, he said, his voice steady. She chose to remain silent, but I won't. What happened to me and to Maria was a crime, and I'm here to make sure those responsible are held accountable. His words struck a chord with everyone in the room, solidifying the case against Ricardo and the others. That evening, back at the mansion, Maria and Alejandro sat together, exhausted but hopeful. You were incredible today, Alejandro said, his voice filled with admiration. So were you, Maria replied, her smile faint but genuine. I'm proud of you, Alejandro. Not just for standing up for yourself, but for standing up for all the others who've suffered like we have. Alejandro nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. This isn't just about us anymore. When this trial is over, I want to make good on what we talked about, creating something to help others, to make sure this never happens again. Maria reached over and placed her hand over his. "And I'll be right there with you." As the night deepened, Maria allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt like justice was within reach. The pain of the past would never fully fade, but with Alejandro by her side, she had found strength she didn't know she possessed. Together, they were turning their story of loss into a legacy of hope and change. The trial continued over the following weeks, with each day bringing new revelations and a deeper understanding of the criminal network that had preyed on vulnerable families. Witness after witness took the stand, some offering damning evidence, others revealing their own roles in the operation, often through plea deals arranged by the prosecution. Maria became a symbol of resilience. Every time she entered the courtroom, reporters snapped photos, and whispers filled the gallery. But she walked with her head high, bolstered by Alejandro's steady presence at her side. One afternoon, during a particularly tense session, a surprise witness was called to the stand. Carmen Garcia entered the courtroom, her face pale but composed. She avoided looking at Maria and Alejandro as she took her seat. The gallery erupted in murmurs, and even Maria felt a jolt of shock. Alejandro leaned toward Victoria, who sat beside him. "She didn't tell me she'd agreed to testify," he whispered. Victoria frowned but kept her eyes on the proceedings. "This could go either way. Let's see what she says." The prosecutor approached Carmen with careful steps. "Mrs. Garcia, you were involved in the adoption of Alejandro Garcia, correct?" Carmen hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "And when did you become aware that the adoption was illegal?" She swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward Alejandro, who stared at her with a mixture of anger and curiosity. "Not at first," she said. "At the time, I believed it was legitimate. But later, I learned the truth. I chose to stay silent." "Why?" the prosecutor pressed. Carmen's voice trembled as she spoke. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of losing the family I'd built, afraid of the consequences. I convinced myself that it was too late to undo what had been done." Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret. Alejandro's expression hardened, but Maria's face remained unreadable. The prosecutor continued. "Mrs. Garcia, do you have any knowledge of the broader network involved in this operation?" Carmen nodded slowly. "I was told by Ricardo Vasquez that there were others, doctors, lawyers, wealthy families who funded the operation. I didn't ask questions, but I knew enough to understand it was much bigger than I wanted to admit." Her testimony was devastating, further solidifying the prosecution's case. When she left the stand, she glanced briefly at Alejandro, as if seeking forgiveness, but he didn't return her gaze. That evening, back at the mansion, Alejandro and Maria sat in the dining room, the weight of the day pressing heavily on both of them. "I didn't know she was going to testify," Alejandro said, breaking the silence. "I don't know if she's trying to make amends or save herself." Maria took a sip of tea before responding. "Maybe it's both. But her words helped the case today. That's what matters." Alejandro nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "Do you think she deserves forgiveness?" Maria set her cup down carefully, considering his question. "Forgiveness isn't about what she deserves. It's about what you can live with. If forgiving her gives you peace, then do it. But if it doesn't, don't force yourself." Alejandro looked at her, his admiration for her wisdom clear. "What about you? Could you forgive her?" Maria's gaze softened, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't know. But I do know that holding on to anger won't change the past. It's a question I'll answer in time." As the trial reached its final days, the courtroom was packed. The prosecution delivered a powerful closing argument, laying out the evidence in meticulous detail and emphasizing the impact on families like Maria's. When it was the defense's turn, they attempted to deflect blame onto Ricardo, framing him as the mastermind while minimizing the roles of the other defendants. But their arguments felt hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence. Finally, it was time for the jury to deliberate. The wait was excruciating, stretching into hours, then days. Maria and Alejandro tried to distract themselves, but every moment was filled with anticipation. One evening, as they sat in the mansion's library, Alejandro spoke suddenly. "No matter what the verdict is, we've already won something." Maria looked at him, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "We found the truth," he said. "We exposed what happened. And we've given others the courage to come forward. That can't be taken away, no matter what happens in that courtroom." Maria smiled faintly, his words easing some of the tension in her chest. "You're right. And I'm proud of us, for not giving up." The verdict came 3 days later. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed in, their faces unreadable. The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper with the final decision. On the charges of conspiracy, human trafficking, and fraud, Ricardo Vasquez and the other key defendants were found guilty on all counts. Maria's breath caught as relief and emotion flooded her. Tears streamed down her face, and she reached for Alejandro's hand, squeezing it tightly. He looked at her, his own eyes shining with emotion. "It's over," he said softly. Maria nodded, her voice trembling. "No. It's just beginning. For the first time, we can finally start to heal." As they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed them, cameras flashing and questions flying. Alejandro shielded Maria as best he could, but she turned to the crowd, her voice clear and unwavering. "This is a victory for all the mothers who never gave up," she said. "For all the children who were taken, for all the families who were broken. Justice has been served, but our work is far from done. We will continue to fight for those who need it." The crowd erupted in applause, her words resonating deeply. That night, as Maria sat in the garden, she looked up at the stars, feeling a peace she hadn't known in decades. Alejandro joined her, sitting silently by her side. "Thank you," he said after a while. "For what?" Maria asked, her voice soft. "For never giving up on me," he said. "For being my mother, even when the world tried to take that away from you." Maria smiled, her heart full. "You've always been my son, Alejandro. No one could ever change that." Together, they sat in the quiet of the night, knowing that while their journey had been long and painful, it had also been worth every step. The weeks following the verdict were a whirlwind of emotions, logistics, and unexpected changes. Maria and Alejandro found themselves at the center of a national conversation about justice, corruption, and the resilience of families. Their story inspired others to come forward, mothers who had lost their children, adoptees who questioned their origins, and even former members of the adoption network seeking redemption by exposing what they knew. Maria, however, felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. She had spent years fighting for answers, and now that justice had been served, the quiet moments felt almost foreign to her. Yet, she also knew that this wasn't the end of her journey, it was the beginning of something bigger. One morning, Alejandro joined her in the mansion's sunlit kitchen. He carried a stack of papers, his face alight with purpose. "I've been thinking about our next steps," he said, setting the papers on the counter. "This fight isn't over, Maria. What happened to us happened to so many others. We need to make sure their voices are heard." Maria looked at him, her brow furrowed. "What do you have in mind?" Alejandro spread out the papers, revealing plans for an organization, a foundation that would provide resources to families affected by illegal adoptions. It would offer legal assistance, counseling, and investigative support, helping reunite families and bring perpetrators to justice. "I want to call it La Fundación Esperanza," he said, his voice soft but firm. "The foundation of hope. For the families who are still searching, for the mothers who refuse to give up." Maria's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. "It's beautiful, Alejandro. And it's exactly what we should do. The launch of La Fundación Esperanza became a beacon of hope for many. Alejandro used his resources and connections to build a team of dedicated lawyers, social workers, and advocates. Maria became the heart of the foundation, her story and presence inspiring trust and determination in everyone who sought their help. Their first major success came just months after the foundation opened its doors. A young woman named Sophia approached them, trembling as she clutched a faded birth certificate. She had grown up suspecting she was adopted, but her parents refused to discuss it. After hearing Maria's story, Sophia decided to seek the truth. Maria took Sophia's hands in hers, her voice steady. "We'll help you, Sophia. No matter where this journey leads, you won't be alone." Through meticulous investigation and emotional perseverance, the foundation uncovered Sophia's true origins. She was reunited with her biological mother, a woman who had never stopped searching for her. The reunion was bittersweet, filled with tears and tentative hugs, but it marked the first of many victories for the foundation. Despite the successes, Maria and Alejandro faced challenges as well. Some of the implicated families fought back, using their wealth and influence to try to discredit the foundation. Anonymous threats resurfaced, and attempts were made to sabotage their work. One evening, as Maria and Alejandro reviewed case files in the mansion's study, a brick crashed through the window, shattering glass across the floor. Alejandro rushed to Maria's side, shielding her from the debris. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "I'm fine," Maria said, though her hands trembled. "But they're trying to scare us again." Alejandro's jaw tightened, his anger palpable. "They won't succeed. We'll increase security and keep going. No one will stop us." The incident only strengthened their resolve. Maria and Alejandro doubled their efforts, ensuring that La Fundación Esperanza remained a force for good. 1 year after the foundation's launch, they held a commemorative event in the mansion's gardens. Families who had been reunited through their efforts gathered, sharing stories of loss, love, and newfound hope. Maria stood at the center of the crowd, her heart swelling as she looked around. Sophia approached her, now visibly confident and radiant, holding her biological mother's hand. "Thank you," Sophia said, her voice filled with emotion. "You gave us back what we thought we'd lost forever." Maria smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "You gave yourself back, Sophia. We only helped you find the way." As the evening continued, Alejandro took the stage to address the crowd. His voice was strong, filled with the conviction of a man who had transformed his pain into purpose. "My mother, Maria," he began, his gaze locking on her, "taught me that hope is stronger than fear, and love is stronger than lies. Together, we've created something that proves the power of truth. Thank you for standing with us and for believing that justice is possible." The audience erupted in applause, their faces glowing with hope and gratitude. That night, as the last guests left and the mansion grew quiet, Maria and Alejandro sat together on the terrace, looking out at the moonlit gardens. "You've changed so much, Alejandro," Maria said softly. He smiled at her, his expression warm. "Because of you. You gave me back my roots, my identity. You gave me a reason to fight." Maria placed her hand over his. "And you've given me a family again. I'll always be grateful for that." Under the stars, they sat in silence, their bond unbreakable. The road they had traveled had been long and fraught with pain, but it had led them to this moment, a future filled with hope, healing, and the promise of justice for those who still waited. The weeks following the foundation's commemorative event were a whirlwind of activity. Calls and emails flooded in from families seeking help, and Maria and Alejandro found themselves busier than ever. The work was exhausting, but it was fulfilling in a way neither of them had experienced before. One day, as Maria organized case files in her modest office within the foundation's headquarters, Alejandro entered, holding a letter in his hand. His expression was one of cautious curiosity. "This just arrived," he said, placing the envelope on her desk. Maria looked at the envelope. It was plain, with no return address, but the handwriting was elegant and unfamiliar. She opened it carefully, unfolding a handwritten note. The words were brief but struck her like a lightning bolt. "You don't know me, but I know you. I believe my child may also have been taken by the network. Please, I need your help. Meet me at Café Hidalgo tomorrow at 3 p.m. I'll explain everything." Maria's heart raced as she reread the letter. She looked up at Alejandro, who had been reading over her shoulder. "What do you think?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease growing in her chest. Alejandro frowned. "It could be someone genuine, or it could be a trap. After everything we've faced, we can't take chances." Maria nodded. "Then we'll approach carefully. But if there's a chance to help someone else, we have to try." The following afternoon, Alejandro insisted on accompanying Maria to the café. They arrived early, the bustling streets of the city alive with chatter and the clinking of dishes from nearby restaurants. Café Hidalgo was a quaint place, its wooden tables and colorful tiles exuding warmth. Maria and Alejandro chose a table near the window, where they could see anyone approaching. They didn't have to wait long. A woman in her late 40s entered, her face lined with worry and fatigue. She scanned the room before spotting them and hesitating for a moment. Then, with visible determination, she approached their table. "Are you Maria Ramos?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Maria nodded, rising to greet her. "Yes. And this is Alejandro Garcia, my son." The woman sat down, her hands clutching a small purse as if it were a lifeline. "My name is Isabel," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been following your story. I think my daughter was taken by the same people who took your son." Maria leaned forward, her expression soft but attentive. "Tell us everything you can, Isabel. We'll do everything in our power to help you." Isabel's eyes filled with tears as she recounted her story. Over 20 years ago, she had given birth to a baby girl in a private clinic. Shortly after the birth, she was told her daughter had died from complications. But she had never seen the body, and the clinic had refused to provide any records. The pain had haunted her for decades, and when she read about Maria and Alejandro's fight, she felt a spark of hope she hadn't felt in years. "I know it sounds crazy," Isabel said, her voice breaking. "But I never believed them. I've always felt in my heart that my daughter is alive." Maria reached across the table, placing her hand over Isabel's. "It doesn't sound crazy at all. I felt the same way about Alejandro. A mother's heart knows." Alejandro, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Do you have any records from the clinic? Anything that might help us investigate?" Isabel nodded, opening her purse and pulling out a folder. Inside were faded documents, including her admission papers, a discharge summary, and a single photo of her holding her newborn daughter just hours after the birth. Alejandro took the folder, his expression serious. "We'll start here. Our team will investigate the clinic and the people involved. If your daughter is out there, we'll find her." Tears streamed down Isabel's face as she whispered, "Thank you." Back at the foundation, Maria and Alejandro handed Isabel's documents to their investigative team. The clinic had closed years ago, but the names of the staff and administrators provided a trail to follow. Days turned into weeks as the team worked tirelessly, uncovering connections between the clinic and the adoption network. Several leads emerged, including a possible match for Isabel's daughter, a young woman named Valeria, adopted by a prominent family and now living in Guadalajara. When Maria and Alejandro shared the news with Isabel, her reaction was a mix of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. "Do you think it's really her?" Isabel asked, her hands trembling. "There's a strong chance," Alejandro said gently. "But we need to confirm it. We'll reach out to her and arrange for a DNA test if she's willing." The day Valeria agreed to meet was filled with anticipation. Maria accompanied Isabel to the meeting, which took place in a private room at the foundation. When Valeria entered, her resemblance to Isabel was striking, her dark eyes, the curve of her smile. The reunion was tentative at first, filled with cautious questions and hesitant smiles. But when the DNA results confirmed their connection, the room erupted in tears and embraces. Isabel held Valeria tightly, as if making up for every lost moment. Maria watched the scene unfold, her own heart swelling with a mixture of joy and bittersweet longing. She turned to Alejandro, who stood beside her, his expression filled with pride. "This is why we do this," Maria said softly. Alejandro nodded, his voice steady. "Because every family deserves their chance to heal." That night, as Maria walked through the mansion's quiet halls, she felt a deep sense of peace. The journey was far from over, but with each victory, they were building something lasting, a legacy of hope and resilience. As she stood by the window, looking out at the stars, Alejandro joined her. "You've given so many people hope, Mama," he said, his voice filled with emotion. She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "We've done it together, Alejandro. And we'll keep going, for as long as it takes." Together, they stood in the quiet of the night, knowing that their work was more than a mission, it was a promise to every mother, every child, and every family still searching for their light. The months passed, and La Fundación Esperanza flourished, becoming a beacon for families across the country. Cases poured in daily, and though the work was grueling, Maria and Alejandro found purpose in every reunion, every answered question, and every truth uncovered. Their journey, once defined by loss, was now guided by hope. One afternoon, Maria sat in her office reviewing a case file about a mother searching for twins taken under suspicious circumstances. The details mirrored her own story in haunting ways, and her heart ached for the woman's pain. A knock at her door broke her concentration, and she looked up to see Alejandro standing there, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside. Maria gestured for him to sit, closing the file and giving him her full attention. "What is it?" Alejandro hesitated, then placed a letter on her desk. The envelope was addressed to La Fundación Esperanza, but it bore no sender's name. "It's from one of the families implicated in the network. A prominent one." Maria's brow furrowed as she opened the envelope. The letter inside was carefully worded but carried a veiled plea for help. "We were told lies, just like so many others. We didn't know the child we adopted was taken from their family. Please, we need to speak with you. We want to make this right." Maria's emotions churned as she read the words. Over the past year, she had come to terms with the anger she felt toward the families who had participated, knowingly or not. But this was the first time one of them had reached out, admitting their guilt and asking for guidance. "What do you think?" Maria asked, looking up at Alejandro. "I think it's complicated," he said honestly. "If they truly didn't know, then they're victims too, in a way. But if they're lying, this could be a way to protect themselves." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "Either way, we need to hear them out. If they're sincere, they can help us unravel more of the network. If not, we'll deal with it." The meeting was arranged in a neutral location, a quiet office space owned by the foundation. Maria and Alejandro arrived early, joined by Victoria and a trusted investigator. The family, a couple in their 60s, entered timidly. Their faces were lined with worry, and the woman clutched a photograph in her trembling hands. "Thank you for seeing us," the man said, his voice heavy with regret. "We weren't sure if you'd agree to meet." Maria offered a small nod. "We're here to listen. Please, tell us your story." The couple explained how they had adopted a baby boy over 25 years ago through what they believed was a legitimate agency. The paperwork had been impeccable, and the adoption had been finalized without issue. But as news of the illegal network surfaced, they began to question everything. "We saw his photo in one of your reports," the woman said, her voice breaking. She held out the photograph she had brought, a picture of a young man with strikingly familiar features. "It's him, isn't it? He's one of the children." Maria took the photo, her chest tightening. The resemblance to a missing child listed in their database was undeniable. "We think he deserves to know the truth," the man added. "Even if it means losing him. We owe him that much." Alejandro leaned forward, his tone calm but firm. "Do you understand what this means? Once we confirm his identity, he'll have the right to choose whether he wants to stay in your lives. You may lose him." The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We just want to make things right." The Foundation's team worked quickly, comparing the young man's details to the missing child's records. A DNA test was arranged, and within weeks, the results confirmed what they suspected: the boy was indeed one of the children taken by the network. Maria and Alejandro accompanied the couple to share the truth with their son, a young man named Daniel. The meeting was tense and emotional, Daniel's face shifting from confusion to anger to disbelief as he absorbed the revelation. "You're saying I'm not your son?" he asked, his voice shaking. "We're saying you were stolen," the woman replied, her hands trembling. "And we didn't know. We thought we were saving you, but we were part of something terrible." Daniel turned to Maria, his expression desperate. "What happens now?" Maria stepped forward, her voice gentle. "You have choices, Daniel. We can help you find your biological family if that's what you want. But whatever you decide, you're not alone in this." In the weeks that followed, Daniel met his biological parents, who had never stopped searching for him. The reunion was bittersweet, filled with joy and sorrow as they navigated the complexities of their newfound relationship. Meanwhile, Daniel chose to remain in contact with his adoptive parents, recognizing that while they had been complicit, they had also loved him deeply. Maria and Alejandro watched the journey unfold with pride and hope. The case became a shining example of how even the most tangled stories could find resolution through truth and compassion. One evening, as Maria prepared to leave the Foundation, Alejandro stopped her by the door. "I've been thinking about something," he said, his voice contemplative. "What is it?" Maria asked, tilting her head. "We've done so much already," Alejandro said. "But I think we can go further. What if we expanded the Foundation? Reached more people, not just here but across the country?" Maria smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "I think it's a wonderful idea. The more families we can help, the better." Alejandro nodded, his resolve firm. "Then let's make it happen. Together." As they stepped out into the cool evening air, Maria felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but with Alejandro by her side and the Foundation thriving, she knew they were building something truly lasting, a legacy of justice, healing, and unwavering hope. The expansion of La Fundación Esperanza was no small task. Alejandro and Maria poured their energy into it, driven by their shared vision of reaching every corner of the country where families still yearned for truth and justice. They met with potential donors, partnered with local organizations, and spoke at events to rally support. Slowly but surely, the Foundation grew into a nationwide movement. One morning, as Maria arrived at the Foundation's headquarters, she was greeted by the familiar hum of activity. Volunteers sorted through case files, phones rang with new inquiries, and families waited in the reception area, clutching photographs and documents. As Maria made her way to her office, a staff member approached her with an urgent message. "Mrs. Ramos," the young woman said, her voice filled with excitement, "a representative from an international human rights organization wants to speak with you. They're interested in partnering with us to bring global attention to our cause." Maria's heart raced. The possibility of expanding their reach beyond national borders felt both exhilarating and daunting. She immediately scheduled a meeting, knowing Alejandro would want to be involved. A week later, Maria and Alejandro sat in the Foundation's conference room, facing a woman named Dr. Elena Vargas, a representative from the International Commission for Justice and Equality. Elena was a poised and passionate advocate, her presence commanding but warm. "We've been following your work," Elena began, sliding a folder across the table. "Your efforts have not only brought justice to countless families but have also exposed a systemic issue that goes beyond your borders. We believe this could become a global initiative." Maria opened the folder, her eyes scanning reports of similar cases in other countries, families torn apart by corruption, children lost in bureaucratic mazes. Her chest tightened with both sorrow and determination. "We've always dreamed of reaching more people," Maria said, her voice steady. "But this is bigger than anything we imagined." Alejandro leaned forward, his tone resolute. "If we can help others avoid what happened to us, then we're all in. What do you need from us?" Elena smiled. "Your leadership, your story, and your willingness to collaborate. Together, we can create a network that spans continents, offering hope to families everywhere." The partnership marked a new chapter for the foundation. Maria and Alejandro traveled to conferences and workshops, sharing their journey and training others to replicate their model. They met with survivors from all walks of life, each story a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. One of the most poignant moments came during a visit to Argentina, where a mother named Clara approached Maria after a speaking event. Clara had lost her son during a dark period of political turmoil and had spent decades searching for him. "I've read about you," Clara said, her voice trembling. "You give me hope that I might find him, even after all this time." Maria took Clara's hands in hers, her gaze unwavering. "Hope is what kept me going, even when the world told me to stop. Never let go of it, Clara. We will help you." Back in Mexico, the foundation celebrated its second anniversary with an event at the mansion. Families reunited through their efforts filled the gardens, their laughter and tears a testament to the power of truth and love. As Maria stood by the fountain, watching a little boy run into his mother's arms, Alejandro approached her with a glass of sparkling water. "You've built something incredible," he said, his voice filled with pride. "We've built it," Maria corrected, her smile soft. "And it's only the beginning." They were interrupted by a staff member, who handed Alejandro a phone. He stepped aside to take the call, his expression shifting from curiosity to joy as he listened. When he returned, he was grinning. That was the Human Rights Council. They've nominated La Fundación Esperanza for an international award for social justice. Maria gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Alejandro, that's unbelievable." "You deserve it," he said, his eyes shining. "Your strength, your story, it's changed lives, Mama. Including mine." Later that night, after the event had wound down and the mansion was quiet again, Maria walked through the garden, taking in the stillness. Alejandro joined her, as he often did, their steps in sync as they wandered under the moonlight. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" Alejandro asked suddenly, his voice thoughtful. Maria paused, turning to face him. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remind myself that what we've built wouldn't exist without the pain we went through. It doesn't erase the loss, but it gives it meaning." Alejandro nodded, his expression pensive. "You've taught me that strength doesn't come from avoiding pain, it comes from facing it and using it to create something better." Maria smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "You've become the man I always knew you could be, Alejandro. And now, together, we're helping others find their own strength." They stood in the garden, the stars above them a silent witness to their journey. The road had been long, filled with unimaginable pain and challenges, but it had led them here, to a place of healing, hope, and purpose. Maria reached out and took Alejandro's hand, her voice steady and full of conviction. "We're not done yet. There are still families out there waiting for their light." Alejandro squeezed her hand, his gaze steady. "Then let's keep going. Together." Under the vast expanse of the night sky, they stood united, their bond unbreakable, their mission clear, to bring hope and justice to those who needed it most.